Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this webinar today. It's so wonderful to have all of you. And Judy, thank you so much for speaking as a guest on this live webinar, and also for being one of the main speakers in the Soul-Centered series. Very grateful for your participation there.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, that was me turning off my phone that I forgot to turn off.
That's great. Good reminder. I don't actually know where mine is, but hopefully it won't ring. So in terms of my introduction to you, Judy, I don't know if you know this, but I am such a huge fan of your writing. I love all of the blogs that you've written, and I really just love the way that you express in your writing, how you point to the principles. So that was my first introduction to you. And then I had the opportunity of hearing you speak at the 3P UK conference. And I was deeply moved by the work that you were doing. And I know that you've worked in many different capacities. I know that, as you mentioned earlier, you were in Laconer Consulting, and you've worked in academia. And but you were sharing at that time at the conference about the work that you had been doing, working with prostitutes, and the grant that you had received. And it was just your ability to be able to share the understanding and have the tremendous impact that you were having with the women that you're working with really touched my heart. So I just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then also Barb Patterson and I had you as a guest speaker on the Solopreneur Mastermind that we do. And so it was really wonderful to hear about how your entrepreneurial endeavors had also been influenced by the understanding. And so it was great to see the practicality in so many ways of what the understanding does for us in our lives, and how it has been demonstrated in your life in that way. And so for today, we're really looking at hearing from you in terms of what your experience has been over the years in terms of learning the understanding, how it was for you in terms of your introduction to Sydney Banks, what the impact he had on your life. That's been a really rich conversation that we've been hearing people share related to. And then what you're seeing now as you look in the direction of the principles, like what's really alive and present for you at this point in time. Does that work for you?
Works. Yes, I'm sorry, works fine for me. I would love to talk about any and all of that. So thank you very much. And I really am a fan of yours too. So, so we're in each other's fans club, I have to say. And I love the little videos that you and Angus do together. They're so sweet.
Thank you.
I work at, among other things, I work with women who are usually it's relationship problems or work problems that brings them to the Women's Resource Center, and I have occasionally referred them to your videos because they're so, just so dear and so close to the heart of what couples go through together. It's very sweet.
Well, that's lovely feedback. Thank you.
So, well, gosh, I as I think a lot of people have heard me talk about many, many times, I was introduced to the principles 3 weeks after my doctor told me that I was going to die young because I was so stressed. And I refused to take Valium, which was the drug of choice for stressed out people in my day and at that time. And because I was running a company that required me to be on top of my work and think clearly, I just wasn't going to take some kind of mind-altering, snooze-inducing drug. So, and I'm not a big believer in psychotropic medications and never have been. So I refused, and he said, well, there's nothing I can do for you, but you're killing yourself. And if you don't do something about the level of stress that you're under, I don't know what to tell you. But the only thing I've got to offer is drugs. So that got my attention, but I didn't know what to do. And I just decided, well, I guess I'm going to die young. I mean, I kind of had that. I was kind of resigned to it at the time because I thought, well, maybe I won't. Maybe some miracle will happen. And I just didn't know what to do about it. So I, ignored it and went on. And just a few weeks after that, a friend of mine, a physician, I was running a physician practice management business, and that I had started. And a good friend of mine said, "I've got a client for you, and I'd like you to meet this person because I really think you'd be a wonderful client. He really needs help very badly, and I know your company can help him." And at that time, I was so overwhelmed by my business and so consumed by I used to tell people, I do the impossible for the ungrateful. That was a terrible thing, but that's what I told people. And I just didn't want any new clients. I was trying to figure out a way out of it, not to get deeper into it. But this guy was a good friend of mine, and he kept insisting, "Oh, no, it's a small practice. You won't mind. And he needs help." And so that's how I got introduced to Bill Pettit. And he was a solo practitioner in Bradenton. His wife was pregnant with their fourth child. And he was driving an old rusty car. I mean, it was so rusted out that on the passenger side, there was a big hole in the floorboard. So if you drove anywhere with him in the rain, the water just came up through the floorboard of the car. And he didn't care. He was just loving his work and loving what he did. But I think his wife was starting to say, if 4 children, it's going to be a little expensive. We really need some income here. And he had plenty of receivables, but he didn't know very much about running the business of his practice. He'd be the first to say that. And he wasn't that interested in it because he was interested in his patients. And so when I met him, in our first encounter, I was overwhelmed by the fact that he was so happy despite what the average doctor would call horrifying circumstances. He had $400,000 in receivables and 0 cash flow. And that was after 18 months in practice. And, it was undisturbed by this. He just figured there's an answer there, and I'm glad to have met you. Your company can help me, but somebody will figure it out. And he was and yet he wasn't irresponsible. He just had an attitude that things work out. And now that he was taking steps in the direction of getting this figured out, it would get figured out. And he had a very, very easygoing, he just wasn't like any doctor I'd ever met in my life before. And I knew a lot of doctors. So we had 167 of them under management. And and I'm sitting there going like, he must have some kind of really fabulous drug. That's the only thing I could think of. And, I didn't want to ask. I thought that would be sort of rude, but I was thinking, what is it that he knows? Because I had other psychiatrists in our business that were just bitter and unpleasant and very difficult to deal with, and always down on people and discouraged by their practice. And he was like, he just loved his patients, and he kept talking about how wonderful people are. And so finally he said, "You look a little puzzled." And I said, for one thing, it's your attitude that's just amazing to me, but also I'm looking at all these files and I'm thinking, gosh, you've only been here 18 months. That's a lot of patient files for a solo psychiatrist. I said, where are all those people? And he looked at me kind of like you look at a little kid who says, does the sky fall? And he said, "Well, I'm imagining they're having a nice life." And I just didn't know what to do with that. I had never heard a psychiatrist say that his patients were having a nice life. I'd heard psychiatrists say, well, they're managed on drugs now. They've got a stable, they were able to go back to work part-time. They're not beating their kids anymore. Things like that. Mm-hmm. But I'd never heard the expression, they're having a nice life. And I said, they're having a nice life? And he said, well, isn't that the point? And I said, well, yes, I know it's the point, but I've never heard anybody that does that. So he invited me to come and sit in on a group that he was doing for the families and friends of his patients who were having a nice life, because they didn't believe it either. So he would do these groups that were, the patient had been released and was back at life and having a nice life, and the family was waiting for the other shoe to drop, or the girlfriend or the friends or the coworkers. So he did these public groups to reassure the patients near and dear that that they really were having a nice life and they really had change and they'd be fine. So he said, that's probably the best way for you to learn about what I do. So I started going, the groups were on Thursday afternoons in a building that was really close to where all our offices were close together. So it was very convenient. And I just ran over there at the end of the day on Thursdays and started sitting in on these groups. So I would understand his practice, because for one thing, I had to make a business plan and I needed to understand it. For another thing, I really wanted to know what the deal was. And I'm not going to go into the long story, but needless to say, after about a month, I realized that I was calm. And I hadn't been, trust me, I had been sitting in the groups just being patient, waiting to talk to patients. So I was just sitting there kind of not really listening that closely, just kind of being there and, you know, kind of taking it in, but mostly just looking around the room, waiting for breaks so that I could ask the patients about nice lives. And which they all agreed to talk to me, and it was miracles that were being told to me, but they were told to me in such ordinary terms that it was shocking. You know, somebody would say, yeah, I was in and out of mental hospitals for 25 years, and you know, then I started seeing Dr. Pettit, and now, you know, I'm fine, and I'm planning a trip to California. And you'd say, well, what was your diagnosis? And they'd say agoraphobia, which means you're afraid of crowds or strange places. And this one woman that told me that first, she'd never left her house for almost 20 years. And now she was planning a trip and she was working part-time. And then I'd say, well, how long did you see Dr. Pettit? And I remember her answer was like, oh, I think it was about, 6 weeks maybe. But I didn't see that much of him. She said, I saw him in the hospital a couple of times. And then, you know, I went to some groups that he did. And I might have seen him twice in his office. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around what was going on. And I just had to know. So that's how we ended up bartering for a year, because he didn't have any money and I didn't have any peace of mind. And I thought, well, this is great. You know, I will barter and I'll fix the practice and collect some of these receivables and get him back on his feet and get things running and hire some staff for him that know what they're doing. And I'll sit in on his things. And then he had just been asked to make videotapes for the hospital. One of our hospitals had put in an internal television system so they could play hospital-based tapes for their patients through a TV system. And they wanted him to make videotapes because it would cheer people up and be a nice way to sort of help the patients to feel more optimistic and hopeful. So that gave me an opportunity to get my whole staff trained, because we made the tapes in my conference room. And I had 44 people working for me, and they were the audience. And we made 12 tapes. And it worked out great, because he then could sell the tapes, and for years, as a matter of fact, he sold those tapes. They're beta tapes now. I don't know, nobody has them anymore, but so that's kind of how I got started in the principles. And that's also how I met Sid, because Sid came to visit. Now, at the time that I started back in the mid 80s, if I remember the first conference I went to, there were like 35 people there and everybody was ecstatic. Wow, we've got more than 20 people, you know, because there just weren't that many people that knew anything at all about this. It was very new. And it grew slowly over the years, but it is just all of a sudden started increasing just beyond belief to me. So it would be hard for anybody that's fairly new to understand how amazing this is to me, and how thrilling it is every time I walk into a room and there's, you know, 500 or 600 people or 1,000 people, and I'm like, holy cow, you know, it's happening, and people are really going to get well, and the world is going to change. But at the time, you know, we thought this is pretty slow and incremental, but, you know, it was so obviously a good direction. So the day I met Sid, he had come to visit Bill, and so Bill called me, and he had given me a copy. The only book at that time that Sid had written was Second Chance. And Bill had given me a copy of Second Chance, which kind of baffled me actually, but anyway, I had it. And so Bill called me and he said, the man that wrote that book that I gave you, Second Chance, is going to be visiting, and if you'd like to come, he's going to sit in my office with my staff and talk to my staff, and you're certainly welcome to come sit in. So I went, and to be very honest with you, I was, I thought Sid was a very sweet person and very lovely man. He had a beautiful feeling to him. I couldn't really understand him that well because of the Scottish brogue, and it was, I was sitting in the back of the room and then near the parking lot, and there was a lot of traffic, and so I was just there, and I was just taking it in, and it was pleasant, and I enjoyed it. And then they all went up somewhere, and I was going to go back to work, and I was pulling out of the parking lot, and I had this overwhelming thought to fire one of my clients, who was a very cruel person. He'd been extremely cruel to my staff. He treated me okay because I was the CEO, but I knew he would leave people in tears. He would call and curse people out. He was always complaining. He was worth a lot to us because he was in so much trouble and was so disliked. He was always being sued and having business difficulties. So there was a lot of work for us, which we could bill for, but it was painful. And I had kind of accepted the fact that, well, that's what happens when you go in business with people. Like, you get all kinds, and we just have to deal with it. And I thought, no, we don't. One of the reasons you start a business for yourself is you can pick your clients. Mm-hmm. And I kept trying to override that thought, but I couldn't. So I pulled into the parking lot of all the medical buildings were kind of in the same 2-mile radius. So I pulled into the parking lot where he saw us. It was the other day he was in there. And I went in and I said, I'm going to ask that we end our contract. And my contracts were all that either party could end it with 3 months notice at any time. And I said, so I'm exercising my right to end the contract. And he called me every name in the book. I won't go into it, but it was, if you can think of all the things you might have seen in a bad movie about sailors that are drunk, that every word. and he was ugly and nasty, and he just couldn't believe I would do that to him, and he was going to ruin my reputation and community and blah, 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 blah. And I just sat there and I said, gee, I'm really sorry you feel that way, but I'm just letting you know that we'll make sure your staff is trained, and I'll get everything returned to you in good order. But in 3 months, this is over. So I drove back to the office. I collected my staff, and I told them, and they freaked out because he was worth a lot of money to us, and we were still, we were a growing business. And I said, I recognize that they were insecure, and I thought, there wasn't any point going into the details. And I just said, look, I know that this is kind of a shock to you all, but I'm sure it's the right thing to do. And I'm going to work very hard to make sure we replace this business with people that you will enjoy working with. And so please don't worry. And that wasn't something they normally heard from me, because I was the biggest worrier of all. I was always the one who was like, oh my God, you got to be kidding. This is happening. And I was like, oh, it'll be fine. And they were just like stunned. I remember I can still see them sitting there, stunned. It's like, who is she? And where did she come from? So I just didn't think about it anymore. We did extricate ourselves from that. He did try very hard to ruin my reputation, but it turned out, as I could have predicted had I been in a different state of mind previously, because he was so disliked and he was such a difficult person, that all of a sudden we had a lot of new clients who didn't want to do business with me because I was doing business with him. And if they had to run into him at meetings, and if that was the likes of the people that I was doing business with, they didn't want any part of it. They didn't want to be associated with it. So we did much better than replace that business, and they were nice people. So that leads me to talk about why I was so drawn to what Rohini's doing, because I love the idea of soul-centered leadership. I just love it, because that's what I feel happened to me, is that I lost my attachment to my intellect and I found my soul.
Mm.
And I hope that the story I just told you is an illustration of that, because, you know, for my staff, I mean, there were a lot of people who, after a while, came back and said, thank you so much. It's so much nicer working here now, and so different working, you know, with you, and not to have that horrible client to be scared every time you called. And, you know, they're just little things that you wouldn't never occur to you normally in the regular course of business when you're insecure and upset a lot and you're counting on your intellect to get you out of every situation, that when you calm down and you just see it, it works out differently. And so to me, from that point forward, the whole idea of leadership was coming from the soul and overriding some of the insecure thoughts that tend to plague the intellect of every business person. Every time you look at a balance sheet, it's really easy to get caught up in it. And so that was how I started. And it's so funny, I didn't see Sid for at least a year after that one meeting, which I'm sure he hardly remembered me because I was just sitting in the back of Bill's office, you know, and then I disappeared. But, you know, I saw him, I guess George came and visited, and then Sid was there. And there was a group in Tampa, and there was a bunch of us that got together. And by that time, I'd got much more involved in working, you know, with this understanding. And I told Sid that story, and Sid just laughed, and he said, well, it's so nice you came to your senses. You know, it was like, it's so funny. It's like, it was like, what's the big deal? You know, and that's what I got from all of the encounters that I had over the years, which were a lot with Sid, is the ordinariness of understanding what's true. I mean, you know, when you're talking about just the spiritual truth behind life, it's true for all of us. It's the same for all of us. It is what it is. You know, it was never like, he never made it into a big deal, like some magical thing and some miraculous, if you just saw this, you know, he just didn't have that. He was very deeply grateful for what he had seen. But then having seen it, he realized it's just obvious. You know, and at least that was my experience of it. Mm-hmm. And he didn't like it when people made a big deal about him or made a big deal about the principles or made a big deal about anything. Because, you know, he's like, well, you know, it's really nice when you really understand how things work, isn't it? Hmm. He just said things like that. Yeah, it really helps when you start to see the truth. Yeah, well, it's good that you see that. He'd say things like that. Yeah, good for you. You know, and it wasn't like, you know, oh boy. It's never like that. If however you didn't see it, sometimes he would get a little cross, but you know, he knew we all would sooner or later. And I remember we used to sit in conferences, and he would say to people, well, trust me, I'm a welder with a 9th grade education. If the likes of me could see this, God knows what you could see if you were looking. You know, he didn't take himself too seriously. And I think that's what I noticed most about all the people that I met early on in this work, is that they were just dear, sweet, humble people, and grateful, filled with gratitude to have peace of mind at last, you know, to have peace of mind and to know they had something to offer, and to know that, you know, the world is not doomed, that there's an answer. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, you know, that's the essence of it for me, is the spiritual part of it, which is that truth that by the time you express it, you've lost the feeling of it. You know, as soon as you put it into words, as soon as you tell stories, you know, you've put it into a form and brought this world, and yet it is really of this world. You know, it's of the spiritual realm that we all know, but it's hard to talk about. And so the easiest way to talk about it is the way Sid always talked about it, and the way all learned to talk about it, which was to tell stories, rather than to try to put it into, you know, it was a shock to me when I started having to teach. When I went to West Virginia University for 13 years and was teaching this in the medical school, because you can't just tell stories when you're teaching. They don't like that. So it's kind of like you can't get that through the curriculum committee. So I had to come up with ways of talking about the principles without spoiling things, you know, without making it into an intellectual exercise. And that was a huge challenge for me. I'm sure I failed often because it's so easy to do that. It's so easy to get drawn into saying, well, there's a logic here, and putting it up on the board, and then the next thing you know, you've got a diagram, and then there's some flow chart, and then, you know, it turns into something that it just isn't. And so fighting back the tendency to drag the principles into the intellectual realm and then say that was it, it was interesting. And I kind of understand why this isn't taught widely in academic institutions, because I'm not even sure that's where it belongs, to be honest with you. I think it should be researched. But it really belongs in the realm of discovery, of people discovering things for themselves, and to discover things for yourself. You don't need people explaining them to you in great detail. You know, the more people try to get you to see it their way, you know, if you could just see, look, mind is this, and if you just saw that, you know, then it would make more sense to you what consciousness is. No, you know, you got to see it for yourself. And that's the first thing that I really learned, mostly from Bill and also from Sid, is don't ask me. You know, I can't tell you the number of times I would say to Bill, how tell me again about the connection between thoughts and feelings, and Bill would go, I don't know. What do you think? What do you see? And I noticed that when I first went out to LeConner, was working with the Pranskys, and they used to do a lot of group meetings on weekends. People would come to these big groups, and they would ask all these questions. And I remember just being awestruck by George's unwillingness to answer them, or he would answer them with riddles, so to speak. And I think it probably frustrated a lot of people who were trying to take notes, but that's not where the answer is. The answer is in that common, deep spiritual understanding that we all share. And when it bubbles up through us, we all see it through our own eyes in our own way. And no one person's explanation is going to be that of somebody else. You know, so keep it as simple as possible, and then just look for your truth. Because in a deep and quiet state of mind, your truth is the truth that comes to you, that comes with that feeling of, oh yeah, okay, now I see it. So, and I remember one time I was, when I moved to LeConner, because Sid lived in Salt Spring, was a fairly quick trip. It was a pretty ferry trip, you know, it was a nice trip to go to Salt Spring. So we used to go fairly often, and Sid used to come to LeConner fairly often. But I remember being up there one time, and Sid was fixing up his fireplace. He was very good with his hands. You know, he's a welder, and he was a craftsman. And so he did a lot of his own work around the house, and he was doing something with his fireplace to make it more beautiful. And and I remember I asked him, I said something like, "Oh, Sid, it's so hard for me to imagine somebody with this deep understanding that you have, not just doing that all the time, and which was kind of a dumb question, but it was early on, So, and I remember he looked at me kind of quizzically, and he said, "Well, we're always doing that. What's the big deal?" He said, "The principles are behind every moment of life in the universe. So what is there to do? You might as well do life while we're here." And I remember feeling kind of small and stupid, but he didn't make me feel that way. My thinking about myself made me feel that way. And but I remember thinking after that, how in the world are we ever going to explain this to people like me, who are so used to a complicated world? And that was mostly our client base in O'Connor. We get these busy executives and couples that were trying to run a business and grow a family, and we get all these people that had so much on their minds, and it was a real shock to them that all we really wanted them to do was quiet down. There was no curriculum, there was no notebook, there was no handout, there was no film. It was just, please quiet down, just please, let's just take a walk. I can't tell you the number of times that we would just say to somebody, "Let's just take a little walk." And for people would be so baffled by that. Like, "What do you mean take a walk? I'm paying for this." I take a walk anywhere, but you can't take a walk in a quiet state of mind with somebody that's just not going to engage your intellect anywhere. That's the key. But it's something we can learn to do for ourselves. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really just appreciate how what you're sharing, it's all sort of pointing to the simplicity. Like you started off when you asked Bill, like, where are all these patients? Like, well, they're having a nice life.
Yeah.
And the ordinariness of that, and the how each one of us has our own wisdom and our own knowing and our own understanding that looks very practical and ordinary.
Yeah.
And it is still extraordinary. Yeah. That is designed specifically for us, and that we see it in a way that makes sense to us. We have our own insights and realizations, and then somebody else might have something that sounds completely different, but it's exactly what they needed to hear and see for themselves. Right. Through tapping into that same place, however you want to describe it, that same form of place.
Yeah, and I know one of the most frequent questions, and I'm sure you get this too, is somebody will say, "Well, what can you tell me that you saw that really made a difference to you?" Well, there are a lot of things that, I could tell you, but to you, it would sound like, "Well, so what?" Or "How nice for you." It's like what you see for yourself that makes a difference for you. So it's encouraging to know that it can happen. See, that the stories are valuable in the sense that as we tell stories and as we talk and as we remember moments, it's evidence. It's evidence that, yes, these moments contact people in strange and wonderful ways, and you never know when their eyes will light up and the truth will pop through them. But it's going to be different for everybody. And sometimes it's inscrutable. Sometimes somebody will say, "Oh my gosh, I've had clients sit in my office and they would tell me something they saw and it was life-changing. And when they told me what it was, I was like, huh? That's life-changing?" My own mind, I'm thinking like, I wouldn't have changed my life. Well, of course not, because I'm not living their life. I'm living mine. They're living theirs. But if they see it that way, then they're saved. That's for them. And that's for all of us. So you don't want to be trying to borrow. I know Sid said that over and over again. You can't, you don't want instructions. You don't want only fools, ask other people how to live their life. Yeah. And yet there's, and yet sometimes that's what I think people are expecting. They that you're, and I know one of the things that, you know, you had mentioned me working with the girls that had been trafficked, and one of the things that these girls had been so far away from, as long as they were being run by a pimp, they never had a chance to see anything for themselves or think for themselves. They just had to do what they were told all day long and all night long.
Mm-hmm.
And if they didn't do what they were told, they'd be in trouble. So thinking for themselves was a high-risk activity. And they lost that. They lost the ability to even, you know, just to do the simplest life tasks. And the one thing that I tried so from the very beginning with them was not to tell them what to do, ever. You know, because that cycle had to get broken. Mm-hmm. So they would say, I don't know what to do. And I would say, well, I don't either, but, you know, probably you will know. It'll come to you. And I've had girls argue with me, no, I can't. I don't know how to think. You know, well, yeah, you do. You forgot that you were thinking. You know, even when you were not thinking, you were thinking about not thinking. You know, we had to do that. And when they would start to realize, like I had one girl that just was over the moon with ecstasy because she went to Target and put together an outfit. She actually found a pair of pants and a blouse and some shoes that all went together that she liked, that looked good on her. And nobody told her what to buy. She picked it out. And to her, that was like almost miraculous. You know, to us, that would be like another day at Target. But, you know, she, for her, because she'd been wearing whatever the pimp told her to wear. Mm-hmm. And that's all she had. She didn't like any of it, but it was, you know, it was her street outfits. Mm-hmm. And now she had a pretty outfit that was, you know, kind of girly girl, actually. It was very cute. And, you know, she was so proud of it. And you think about the small things that mean so much to us in life, and yet isn't life just a little string of pearls, of little small things all strung together? And after other, and you go, turn nice. And that's kind of what it is, and that's the point of it.
Yeah.
So let me stop for a moment and see if there's anyone who is wanting to ask a question or make a comment before I say anything more.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll just remind people, if you would like to raise your hand, excuse me, you can click on the participants button, and then you'll see a raise hand button. You can just click on that button, then I'll see that your hand is raised and I'll be able to unmute you. So if anybody has a question that you'd like to ask, oh, here we go. Oh, and I'm sorry, I don't have your name. It's a number, S-O-U-G-R. I'll just unmute you. And
I think, hello, I'm Janet Durgan. Hi, Judy.
Oh, hi, Janet.
Hi. Oh, my gosh. I haven't seen you forever.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
So, of course, I have a question about education and teaching. That's been my career. And as I think you may remember, Judy, I've struggled with how to bring the principles into my school in an overt way, in a classroom, in a faculty seminar for the admin team, etc. And so I know that the chart way of teaching the principles is probably not going to be effective, particularly, not going to be terribly effective. And yet, you know, what you said about education or about learning, that you have to see it for yourself, that it's discovery, that really hangs true for really learning anything at the end of the day. You have to discover it for yourself. You have to see it. So it seems to me there must be some way to kind of marry. I mean, there's, to create an experiential, and obviously a weekend intensive is experiential education, but I haven't had time to think about it enough myself. I hope that's something in my future. Yeah. So I don't really have a specific question, but that just really intrigues me, how to create an experiential education approach to the three principles that is not this exclusively intellectual, let me break it down for you in an outline form so that you can take notes, and yet isn't just somebody telling stories, is creating a process of discovery for the learner.
Well, you know, Janet, I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things that I kind of had to learn over the years at West Virginia was, because I was teaching doctors and people who were getting master's degrees in sports psychology and public health. So there are people that, you know, have a very technical approach to most everything they learn. And I discovered that, you know, that Socrates was onto something, essentially, that the best way to encourage people to look inside and to see something for themselves is to ask questions, and ask a deeper question, and then ask a deeper question. And although it's frustrating for the learner, because they always want to know, is that going to be on the test? You know, it's kind of like, once they get over it, it's a nice process. And I remember I had my first interesting experience with this once when I started a class for a bunch of first-year residents, and they weren't, the dean wanted them to go to my class, but they weren't too excited about it. And I could tell from their attitude coming in that they would rather be somewhere else if they were going to get an hour away from their residence. They'd rather not be sitting in a room with me. And they didn't have any choice. So I thought, you know, I'm just going to go and play with this. And so one of the things I realized is that they thought I represented the kind of fluffy, dumb side of things, you know, the new agey, touchy-feely stuff that doctors hate. And they, but they knew I worked with doctors before in a business, and that was kind of that was my ticket, you know, that I must know something, because doctors had tolerated me and actually done business with me at some point. And so I thought, well, okay, I'm just going to start with a question and see where it goes. So I asked this question. I said, okay, you're all doctors, so how many of you can tell the difference between the living and the dead? And you could see them rolling their eyes like, oh my God, she's dumber than we thought. You know, and I said, no, this is a serious question. How many of you can tell the difference between the living and the dead? And some guy said, well, all of us can, for God's sake. You know, the dead's a corpse, you know, they're dead. And I said, well, what is it? And one of them said, well, you know, the brain activity ceases and the heart stops beating. And I said, that's not what I'm going for. What is the thing that you, before you do that, before you touch them, when you walk in the room, how do you know? And finally, one of them said, well, there is no life. There's no life. The life is gone. You can see it. So I said, well, that's what I'm talking about. That's the spiritual quality that defines what it is to be alive. And you can't describe it, you can't measure it, you can't put your stethoscope on it, and you can't hear it, but you know it. And they were like, you know, that it got into a pretty deep discussion pretty quickly, because it had never dawned on them that there was a spiritual component, that they were only working with the living. You know, once the person died, the doctor abandons ship, you know, then it goes to the mortuary and somebody else goes to work, and that there's something deeper than just the body going on that they had to take into account, which is really why I was brought to the medical school. That's what the dean wanted us to awaken awareness of the fact that there is a spiritual component to the practice of medicine, and if you're missing that, you're missing the point. And so remember, we're having this whole discussion about, well, where does that come from? And I said, I'm not asking a religious question. This is a school question. Where does that come from? Well, they don't know. And then we had the discussion, is it okay to not know things and still take them as true? To not know, we can't know everything. Like we don't really know why there are black holes, and yet astronomers assume there are black holes because we can notice things that cause us to realize that has to be happening. And then I got into a discussion with them about the fact that one of the things that orders what we know is the fact that there is a logic. The deeper you go to something, you soon discover that there's a principle that applies across the board in that area. And, that principles are universal truths. And they would all agree to that because they all understood physics. They all understood biochemistry. They all understood mathematics. And I said, well, why wouldn't there be principles in psychology? Why isn't that a discoverable truth? Why would you fight that? Why would you say, no, that wouldn't make sense? I know, why would those be principles? I'm going like, well, why would the principles of addition be principles? It's because every time you add, they work. If you try to add without the principles of addition, you get 11/7, like little kids do. You get imaginary numbers that make no sense. But if you ask somebody that understands the principle of addition and you say how many people are in the room, they'll count them and they'll give you an accurate answer. So, as I worked over time, and I'm not going to go on and on and on with this, but I discovered that me getting as quiet as possible and clearing my head and really looking for the deeper question. And I actually developed a whole course for the faculty because I was part of the team that created the faculty development program at the medical school, because a lot of doctors are very good doctors and they're called upon to teach, but they don't know how to teach. And so we had a very, very good faculty development program. And my role, the part of it that I was responsible for was how to ask thought-provoking questions that engage the creative, intuitive minds of our students.
Yeah.
So I think that the answer to that issue is always, you can't do with people that are intellectual and very smart people that are intellectual and academic, is you can't teach them anything because they already know everything.
Right.
Especially if they're doctors, But but you can inquire. And they will look, because, and yeah, it's funny when I defended my dissertation committee was interesting, and they were very. I had written a whole portion of my dissertation had to do with intuitive learning as opposed to rote learning, and why intuitive learning was the only way you could truly know.
Yeah.
Because everything else you could forget. It didn't matter. It wasn't yours.
Right.
But intuitive learning belongs to you. And one of the people on my committee was a public health, a person in public health, and he said, well, there's things you have to remember. You have to know certain statistics, and you have to know this, and you have to know that. And he was going on and on about it. And I said, you don't have to know anything, but you will come up with what you need to know. That's the thing you're missing. You're missing the idea that intuitively, if you are taking things in and making them yours, putting them in your own words, seeing them for yourself, not just writing them down and memorizing them, when you need them, they occur to you. It's like, certain lines of poetry are never forgotten. They were something that when you read them and you started really seeing them, it spoke to your soul, and they're just embedded, but there are other things that you may have memorized for a school play that you couldn't even begin the 2 sentences of anymore, because it didn't mean anything. And that's the idea of the intuition, is that we were built to see for ourselves and speak for ourselves. And I think that has a tremendous appeal. Over time, I realized that has a big appeal to people in the academic world.
Yeah, definitely.
I hope that's helpful, but that's
Thanks, Judy.
Yeah. It's great to see you.
Look forward to seeing more of you.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you. Any other questions?
Janet. Yeah, who else has a question? I'll just remind you, if you want to raise your hand, then I'll know to unmute you. Press the participants button and then raise your hand button. Let's see if there's any more questions out there.
Well, I can just go on.
Yeah. Yeah, well, was there something else that you had on your mind, Judy? And we'll see
Yeah.
who wants to raise their hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, there was one more thing that was going back to this subject of leadership and the idea of soul-centered leadership, which I just love that. I just really do. I have to say that, Rohini. I wish I'd thought of it. But I'm glad you did. I used to be a big advocate for years when I was first involved in business, and I got my very first leadership position when I was 25 years old. So I've been running things for a long time. You know, it's kind of like I wasn't very good at it, but there I was, and I got very engaged very quickly in the whole idea of servant leadership, which was a big thing to me. And the nature of servant leadership really, in essence, is to be in service to the people that you're trying to lead rather than to be a bully, basically. And a lot of leadership is based on, you know, effective bullying of people, whatever you call it. But it's just like, you know, I'm in charge and you're going to do this. And servant leadership is like, I'll step out to the edge and see if you want to come along. And yet, it was not that. I mean, in theory, it really appealed to me, but in practice, I couldn't remember it when I needed it. You know, like I would read the theory and I would think about it and I would think, how would I do this, you know, in the abstract? And then when the moment came, I would turn into like everybody else, the bully, you know, like, okay, this is what we're going to do. You do this, you do that. And I was like, why isn't this working for me? I really like the idea, but I'm not good at it at all. As a matter of fact, I'm terrible at it. And when I first really started to see the principles at work, I realized that you can't be a servant leader with a busy mind. And you can't be a servant leader if you're insecure, because your thinking isn't going in that direction. Your thinking is not going in service to people. It's like, if I remember one time I was with Roger Mills and we were speaking in New York at a meeting, and it kind of somehow we both got kind of caught in our heads a little bit, and we took a break because we saw it, you know, and I said to Roger, it's kind of, I don't know what it is about this audience that's making me, you know, I'm just getting insecure in front of these people. And Roger said, well, I tell you what, he said, the only thing I've learned, and this was such good advice, I've never forgotten it, and I've always been appreciative. Every time I think of it, I have a little smile for Roger. He said, one of the things I've learned is that when I get insecure in front of a group, it's because I'm thinking about how am I doing? And when I get over being insecure, I think about, is this working for them? And, you know, being in service rather than trying to prove something or show how good you are. And that just really spoke to my heart at that time. I remember thinking, that's the whole key, isn't it? You know, that's what's missing when you study servant leadership, but you don't know what service is. You know, you don't know that's putting other people's well-being and, you know, putting yourself in the same boat with them. And one of the first things that happened for me, the reason my business changed dramatically for me, and I really came to appreciate it, was that I really saw my clients as adversaries. I didn't realize that I did, but I did, because they were difficult and they complained a lot and they were demanding and they were never satisfied and they always haggled and you know, they asked a lot of ridiculous questions that, you know, I understand now that I ask ridiculous questions too when I don't really understand something, but, you know, I didn't wasn't thinking that way. And so it was like, you know, it's like a lot of doctors, we always tease them and say it'd be a great field if it wasn't for these damn patients. Well, I was like, you know, this would be a great business if it wasn't for my clients. You know? So, you know, and when I realized the reason that I exist, the reason that these people are paying me, the reason they hired me is because they get insecure. And there's something they don't understand. And when you get insecure, you're not at your best. You know, it's not when you ask the questions in the nicest way. And it's not like you're going to admit, yeah, I'm really insecure about this. I hope you can explain it to me. You know, instead the question comes out more like, are you stupid or something? Why can't you make this clear? You know what I'm saying? It's like, you know, we don't even realize that. And when I started realizing that my job was to treat the state of mind before I answered the question, everything changed. Mm-hmm. Everything changed. Mm-hmm. Not just the little things. Everything changed because I was working at that soul level, soul to soul, human being to human being. And I didn't, you know, I would never say to somebody, well, I know you're insecure. I mean, that would be rude and mean and terrible and judgmental. But when I realized that somebody was insecure and I didn't want to go there with them, I wouldn't go to the problem immediately. I would go to, let's form a connection here. You know, let's just talk for a minute. Let's just see if we can get on the same page. And I would usually ask them a question about something I knew they knew a lot about or that they liked to talk about. Sometimes it was their family, sometimes it was their hobby, sometimes it was their practice or a certain patient. But, you know, I mean, I would just count on myself to know what to say, but I'd get them on a topic where they would calm down and really get back in the groove of feeling at ease with their own thinking and at peace and quiet with themselves. And then I'd say, well, I don't want to take too much of your time. You know, what was it that you really wanted to ask me? And by that time, the question came out in a way that we could both talk about it without ugliness.
Hmm. I mean, that's fine.
Yeah. Started solving their own problems too, because they calmed down. The next thing you know, they'd say, well, I had a question, but now that I'm thinking about it, don't worry about it.
I know, and that points to how really the answers for all of us are always going to be found inside. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I think we might be having a little technical difficulty.
So the last thing I wanted to, it's okay. That was the last thing I wanted to share because I just feel like we miss that sometimes. That treating the state of mind is so much more important than, you know, and dealing with the problem when everybody's upset. Because you're not going to get anywhere anyway.
Absolutely. And I think that's just such a blessing from having an understanding of how our feelings reflect our state of mind. Because I can't think of any area of life where that isn't useful information to have, whether it's on a personal level in relationship, whether it's internally, personally with myself, whether it's in business situations, like in every area of life, state of mind is a part of that. And having an understanding that we're not in a fixed state of mind, that just like you're pointing to, we all have the capacity within us to settle back down into that place of peace within ourselves. And life changes. It looks different from that place. And when we're not in that place, it looks very different. And it also looks very real. But that shift isn't going into the problem. It's coming back to that place of, oh, where's home again? And can I go back into there? So I love that last point. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So, wow, this time has really flown by.
It has. Well, Judy, thank you so much for participating in the webinar. And as I said earlier, Judy's going to be one of the main speakers in the 6-month program that starts in Santa Monica in the fall, the Soul Centered series. And if anybody has any questions about that program, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone. And I know that a few of the participants on the call are going to be joining us in the live program. So I look forward to seeing all of you in person then.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you so much, Judy. Very grateful for your participation.
It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I really appreciate it. I hope you all, wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in, enjoy the rest of your day.
That's great. I'm going to unmute everybody so you can say goodbye. Bye-bye.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Bye.